Teachers' unions should be talking about education policy. Teachers' unions should be talking about teacher pay, teacher benefits. How can we help our members? I'm not very hopeful that the unions are going to return to sanity given kind of the state of the left. I'm concerned that radical leftism and anti-Western ideology within the unions is kind of here to stay. We have to expose for teachers who are members of the unions what these unions' political activities are and what their dues are actually going to fund. People are voting with their feet. I think a lot of teachers are leaving unions. I know their membership is not what it once was 10 years ago.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, and welcome to this edition of The Podcast. I'm your host, David Bernstein, and I'm delighted to have with me today Paul Zimmerman with the Defense of Freedom Institute. Paul has been on the forefront of looking at sort of ideological capture issues. He's written about the influence of antisemitism in schools, and he's also co-authored a recent report on teachers' unions and their role in spreading radical ideology and antisemitism. Paul, it's great to have you on. Really appreciate your time and appreciate your work. Tell us a little bit more about who you are and the Defense of Freedom Institute.
And thank you so much for having me, David. I really appreciate being on the show. So I work as senior counsel on policy and regulatory matters for the Defense of Freedom Institute for Policy Studies. That is an organization founded in 2021 by two former senior appointees in the Betsy DeVos Department of Education, who came out of the first Trump administration and wanted to engage in advocacy and both on the legal side and on the policy side. So we do some legal work, but we also publish reports. Part of my responsibilities involve running our teacher union accountability project, and these reports came out of that project. And it's really about, for us, exposing the activities of teachers' unions that do not help students and that keep public education from reforming and from helping children have successful careers, preventing school choice and things like that. So these reports, David, that you're talking about came out of that project, and I'm looking forward to discussing them with you.
Yeah, so, we've obviously been watching teachers' unions closely and been sometimes marveling at how ideologically dominated they've been by very specific caucuses or interests, not perhaps everywhere equally. I'm sure that there are states in which the state or local unions are much more on mission and, worrying about teacher pay and the like, and not trying to ideologically indoctrinate students. But, you don't have to look very far to find it. What did you find? I mean, how bad is the problem? How pervasive is the problem? Why don't we start there?
Yeah, I think it was very surprising how pervasive the problem is. One would think that, and for sure, there are teacher unions that are more focused on teacher pay, teacher benefits, and things like that. But a vast amount of unions have become, as you said, ideologically captured, or as you put it. And I think it's from coast to coast. I think it's a matter of the people who are joining the unions and the people that the unions are seeking to join it. They're looking for a younger crowd. They're kind of putting themselves out there as leftist organizations. They're putting a message out there, and they're attracting people who are interested in espousing, these kind of radical ideas in a public education system, and essentially indoctrinating students into their ideology, specifically in this case, I think a really anti-Israel, anti-Zionist mindset that takes the form of anti-Semitism. In many cases, you see teachers' unions that just came out immediately after October 7th, 2023, blamed Israel for the attacks and said that it was, a colonialist oppressor ideology that had dominated Israel, and that was the cause of the attacks. And so you see the influence of kind of radical ideology, I think, rising in national unions, in state unions and local unions, and that's what we're really trying to spotlight and trying to expose to teachers who are still giving money to these unions, or still members and funding this ideology, an opportunity to understand what their message really is, an opportunity to vote with their feet and part ways with their union.
Yeah. So years back, I had an office on M Street in Washington, D.C., right across the street from the National Education Association, the country's largest teachers union. And I used to go there to have lunch because they had like very discounted cafeteria lunch there, and it was very convenient. And it seemed quite, sort of normal. There was no, and now I drove by it recently, and every single window on the building was covered with sort of like ideological pronouncements and the like. And without even going back in there and seeing who's there, it strikes me that it's become something completely different in a relatively short period of time. Because I probably that was probably 2007, 2008. 2009, when I would frequently have lunch there. What do you think has happened in the last, if I'm right about this thesis, maybe you don't agree, 15 years, or even it's obviously predates us some, that's actually changed and made it so radical?
Well, I would even take it back much farther, just because I did a report on the National Education Association and its history. And the National Education Association, as you may know, has a congressional charter that dates to the first decade of the 20th century. Used to be a very not a political organization at all, and they wanted to advance the cause of public education and help professionalize the teaching profession. So even by the point that you were having lunch at the National Education Association, it had changed a lot since its founding into a union, first of all, and also into a very, very political organization and kind of an arm of the Democratic Party. What has happened in the last decade or so? I think what we're seeing is that the National Education Association is kind of a creature of the left. And I think where the left goes and where progressivism goes in kind of an illiberal direction that attacks Western values and basically believes that the United States is just a white supremacist society, and by extension, Israel is also a colonialist oppressor. So I think that kind of ideology, for whatever reason, and I know there are people who are more conversant than I am in talking about exactly why this has happened in the left. But I think that's what's happening in the NEA, and their ranks are swelling with this kind of ideology, and so that's probably part of the reason why why they've gotten so much more radical.
Yeah, it seems to me that like we all knew people who were that far left, and that they've always been trying to get their way into the mainstream or to the mainstream left. It turns out, I think the project was to try to dominate the left. It was never to dominate American society, at least not in this phase. It was always let's seize control of the American left. And so teachers unions were obviously very susceptible, but it's still hard for me to put my finger on why this change happened so much. Is it that a higher percentage of the left has now believes that, or is that a strategic decision or a set of actions on the part of these once fringe elements of the left that have now propelled them into the sort of a dominant role in key institutions. It's just hard to get my head around how, or is it some likely combination thereof of those two things, right?
Yeah, I think that there's a combination. I think that there's a strategy that's happening. I don't mean to be too conspiracy theory oriented, but I think there's a strategy among especially young people on the left. I think they see the teachers unions, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but they see them as resource-rich institutions who have access to the students in the public schools, and I think they see this as kind of low-hanging fruit. They want to change the education system to teach people that America is is rooted in evil, essentially, like evil Western values that we would consider traditional values of freedom and hard work and faith. And so I think people see the unions as a good target so that they can capture these institutions, take their message to the schools. And I think that's happening more and more. Maybe we also notice it a bit more because I think there's starting to be a reaction to this, on the right. And in the center as well, in the mainstream culture, I think people are recognizing, hey, DEI is not such a great idea. Hey, what are these people saying about our allies abroad, about Israel, and what are people saying about America? What are people saying about how the U.S. is just built on slavery and the 1619 Project? So I think that people on the right are kind of waking up to that. So there's a reaction on the right as well.
Yeah, maybe we'll return to the right in a little bit, but it's interesting, that not all of these school districts are the same. You have, we sometimes classify them as sort of type A, type B. Type A being the real radical school districts you see in California and maybe Minneapolis and other places where a group of the most extreme-minded people have sort of taken hold of the reins and are now pushing this ideology that's very explicitly anti-American as well and anti-Zionist and the like. And then there's what I call type B. It's sort of more soft DEI that you could argue softens the ground for the more radical ideology, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have an explicit global program. It's not explicitly anti-American. It's sort of meant to at least officially empower people, but yet uses the same oppressor-oppressed narrative in the way it talks about our society. Have you seen that? Did that show up? And do you think the teachers' unions are more likely to promote type A or type B, or do you see a combination thereof?
I see both. I think that there are different shades of ideology. I don't think everybody out there who's part of a teacher union. Obviously, I think there are some people who are more reasonable than some others. But I do think it's all kind of rooted in a similar direction, which is that basically America, the values on which our Constitution and our institutions are based are fundamentally broken, and they need to be kind of revamped from the ground up. To the extent that some people are on the left are not saying that, or maybe they don't believe that specifically. I do think that the fundamental idea of DEI is that there needs to be there is an oppressed class and there's an oppressor class, and there needs to be a restructuring, kind of a radical restructuring of society based on race, and we need to pay attention to the color of people's skin and their race in order to fix society. That's my understanding of what DEI is. And so I think a lot of teacher unions are pushing that, but they're also pushing a kind of hatred of the Western institutions in some cases. I think California, as you were talking about, is a good case in point when you have ethnic studies curricula that say that Israel is a colonialist oppressor. It's kind of like a bully that's just being empowered by its oppressor, the United States. Yeah, I think there's something fundamentally broken there. And when teachers are pushing this kind of material on on 5-year-old, students and younger, there really is something fundamentally broken about the system. So it does come in all types, but I do think it's kind of rooted in a similar ideology of the Western principles that I was taught in school when I was a kid that were good are actually just white supremacist ideals, which is just ludicrous.
Yeah, absolutely. So you it takes the shape of ethnic studies sometimes. If you ask me, I mean, I followed the situation in California since its inception. I'm not. Can I say it was the teachers' unions that pushed liberated ethnic studies on California, or was it like this activist network that might have included some teachers and teachers' unions? I think it was probably more of a broad ecosystem, and that's probably the case everywhere. What is the distinct role of teachers' unions? What are some of the examples that you're seeing of where teachers' unions have really pushed this agenda?
I see examples of it, and I think you're right that it's not necessarily the leaders of teachers' unions that are inventing this stuff. I think it's people at universities, and I think a lot of times these ideas are incubated in higher education, and teachers are taught about it in teaching schools, and they graduate and kind of bring this to the schools, to the K through 12 schools, bring it to the teachers unions. But what I do see is that, for instance, United Teachers Los Angeles had put members of the liberated ethnic studies curriculum, people who led that effort. They put them in charge of the ethnic studies committee on implementing ethnic studies in the LA Unified School District. I think in a lot of cases, teachers unions are trying to shield teachers from accountability. In one case, I believe it was in San Francisco, that there was an explosion of curricular materials where students were supposed to play out being guards at concentration camps.
Right, I remember that.
And other students were supposed to be victims, and it was supposed to be this oppressor oppressed, basically exercise. So teachers were supposed to get training on what is anti-Semitic and what's not. What is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. Teachers who refused to attend that program and that training were shielded from accountability. The teacher union said that they would protect those teachers who chose not to go to the training. So it's all kind of it's an ecosystem. It's a lot of different people pushing this agenda along in various ways, it's kind of a team effort in that way. I think it's harming these school districts, and it's shielding teachers who are bad and who are espousing anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic rhetoric that has no place in the classroom. It's shielding them from accountability.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've also seen examples where the takeover of a teachers' unions, particularly at the local level, is really by the most extreme forces, like a DSA-dominated teachers union, as you've seen in Chicago, for example, where the teacher union essentially becomes its own political party that is dominated by the DSA, fronts a DSA candidate in the name of Brandon Johnson and becomes mayor, and the like. How much of that have you seen in your research versus just sort of these caucuses within the union pushing their agenda and getting it passed, and using that as a platform to get their stuff in schools? I mean, there is a difference between the kind of most extreme forces that are completely in control versus those that in some of these unions where they have a lot of influence, but maybe aren't completely captured.
I think that's a really important point, and I think what's happening in the national unions is worth looking at in terms of the Democratic Socialists of America and things like Educators for Palestine, or they would say AFT for Palestine, the American Federation of Teachers. These forces are really trying to capture the resources of the national unions. And so they go to the NEA meetings and they organize together. They engage in anti-Israel chants. They intimidate and harass the delegates who come to the NEA meetings, so much so that the Jewish caucus of the NEA wrote an open letter pointing out that they were just subjected to such horrible treatment and didn't feel comfortable. Some had panic attacks. Many couldn't even sit with the section of the teachers that they came with in the same section. And so these organizations are really trying to push the unions to boycott, Israel, to join the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement against Israel. And they are touting their victories, on social media. They're saying, "All right, we got the AFT to tell us that they're not currently invested in any Israeli bonds," or they push this resolution from the NEA that everybody heard about who's been paying attention this past summer to separate the NEA from the Anti-Defamation League, the curricular materials on the Holocaust and things like that. So that's the way they're really, and of course they have the handbook of the NEA, the 2025 handbook that just erased the Jewish people from the history of the Holocaust and didn't mention the 6 million Jews that died in the Holocaust. So you have these groups that are really just rising, and I think, I don't think that the leaders of these unions really know what to do about it. I would say that Randy Weingarten, surprisingly, perhaps, has spoken out against to just the BDS movement, but I think she's losing control of her ranks. And then the NEA is basically just a catastrophe. It's a gaffe machine, and so they push these resolutions, and then they discount the resolutions when they find out that there's so much public blowback. But that can only last so long before people will stop believing that they had nothing, that they're not losing control of their organizations. I think the NEA will keep on going into crisis mode as long as the delegates, the radical, leaders of these of its affiliates continue to push these resolutions, and we're going to have more, next summer, more throughout the year.
So it seems to me that the two unions, I think NEA might not even be considered officially a union. Maybe you can shed some light on that, are a little bit different. I mean, Becky Pringle and NEA seem to me more radical than Randy Weingarten and the AFT, American Federation of Teachers. Traditionally, I mean, AFT was, a classic union, and Randy is Jewish and she's married to a rabbi. And while I'm sure her ideological views are not what are anywhere near ours, she does seem to still think Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state and doesn't give countenance to some of those more radical forces around Israel. And she's done, I think, a lot to keep some of that out. I still have a bone to pick with her, but is that your impression too, that the two unions are not the same? And how do you characterize the difference between the two?
So first off, the NEA is a union. I think they like to try to characterize. They use different terminology. They try to, because of their history, which is over a century old, about 170 years. They kind of harken back to a time when they were not a union, but certainly they are a union. But what's even worse with the NEA that I think you're raising is, I think without kind of a moderating influence, they are really latching on to the anti-Western and anti-Israel mindset. So I totally agree that we need to pay more attention to what the NEA is doing. And we need to realize that the NEA has a congressional charter that was granted, by Congress and by the people of the United States. And it's also one of the most politicized, organizations that only turns out for one, single political party, the Democratic Party. So it's just it is horrendous that they have a congressional charter, and we have proposed revising that charter, especially in the area of anti-Semitism. I think Congress has a real opportunity in the next year or two to revise the NEA charter in order to investigate the ranks of the NEA and root out the kind of anti-Semitism that's there. Now, on the AFT, I think that they are certainly radical, but the one issue where I think where Randi Weingarten is kind of following one of her predecessors, Al Shanker, who was the head of the AFT many years ago and was a staunch supporter of Israel, kind of an old school union person who saw allies in Israel and saw Israel as like a really beneficial project, and beneficial country for the world and for the Middle East. And I remember, doing some research for the report that we put out on anti-Semitism called Breaking Solidarity, which you can find on our website. And just seeing in the 1970s, during one of the wars that Israel was going into, just the AFT resolution that was passed that said we support an independent, and free Israel, and the United States should, support that. And now fast forward 50 years later, and I think there's this real dissension in their ranks, and there's this rising anti-Israel force that I think Randi Weingarten is trying to tamp down. But if it's just her versus this kind of this force, eventually she's not going to be able to control it. And I would just say that we shouldn't even be talking about that with the teachers unions. I mean, teachers unions should be talking about education policy. Teachers unions should be talking about how are we going to to some degree, they obviously should be talking about teacher pay, teacher benefits. How can we help our members? And that's what they should be talking about to another degree.
Right. And they're like so many institutions, they've just sort of lost the plot, right? And they've become sort of platform for political performance rather than, performing their core function. I remember, by the way, Al Shanker, I used to be an avid reader of the New Republic magazine when it was still a good magazine. And he used to have this column that I think was a paid advertisement, and it would be on all kinds of policy issues. And they were always good, by the way. Even if I disagreed with him, he would always have this like sort of compelling one-page argument that was in the New Republic. And it was excellent. And it was sort of reminiscent of what it was like to be a liberal in, maybe the early 1990s, late 80s or whatever. Just a completely different feeling and vibe at that time. And Al Shanker was a good representative of what that was like. Let's pivot for a second, Paul. I like you pay a lot of attention to what's happening with unions. I see them as one of the major vectors of transmission of this ideology into schools. But I have to tell you, it's very hard to come up with a coherent strategy to counter unions. Now, there are internal forces. There's there's a Jewish caucus, and you can build them up. And my organization, North American Values Institute, has worked closely with the Jewish caucus, and helped them gain access to Capitol Hill and the like. And so we see them as an internal ally. But are there other strategies you think that we haven't fully taken advantage of that we could use to sort of change unions, to push them to adhere to their old mission? What's your sense of that?
I'm not very hopeful that the unions are going to return to sanity given kind of the state of the left. Who knows what exactly is around the corner? I'm concerned that radical leftism and anti-Western ideology within the unions is kind of here to stay. So I'm not that hopeful about that. I think we have to recognize that we have to expose for teachers who are members of the unions what these unions' political activities are and what their dues are actually going to fund. We need to continue to do that. People are voting with their feet. I think a lot of teachers are leaving unions. I know their membership is not what it once was 10 years ago. But basically, I think they try to counter that, the AFT and the NEA, especially the AFT, by going after new sectors, new collective bargaining units. They're trying to grow into new areas, and one of those areas is higher education. They're trying to start new chapters with the AA, the American Association of University Professors. And I'll try to get all these acronyms right. I think it's the alphabet soup is hard sometimes. But anyway, I think they're trying to expand, and so I think one strategy that we need to look at is kind of containment. We need to cast a critical eye from policymakers on allowing new collective bargaining units to develop, in higher education and in other areas. And we need to write some laws that protect these areas. I'm not a big fan of public sector collective bargaining in general, and I love it when states recognize that you're really negotiating against the people when you allow that kind of thing. But really, if we can just prevent them from growing in new sectors and spreading that kind of radical message, or at least preventing unions that are spouting off anti-Semitic rhetoric from doing this kind of thing and expanding, then I think we can contain them and really kind of reduce their influence, reduce their malign influence over schools in that way.
Are there organizations that you've been working with, or you know of, who are in this space actively working to sort of limit the impact of teachers' unions right now?
Yeah, and obviously we do it through our Teacher Union Accountability Project, and we try to just expose. I think that's often we try to do deep dive reports and show what's really going on within the ranks. So that's kind of our strategy. And we also have a communications campaign that where we just talk about what unions are doing each day and week. But outside of us, I think there is kind of an ecosystem of organizations that recognize the harm that teachers' unions are doing. I would just spotlight one. The Freedom Foundation, I think, is a great organization. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but I think they're doing great work in trying to provide alternatives to the teacher unions, because a lot of teachers are afraid to leave their union because of the health benefits, because of organizing. So really having kind of having an alternative, or really having knowledge about what there is out there that you can access if you're not a member of one of these really far left, unions in these states, I think is helpful. But there are other competitors, and there are organizations that are doing great work in pointing this stuff. I think the Commonwealth Foundation is another thing. And if you give me more time, I could probably rattle off a good list for you.
Yeah, shoot me an email and I'll put it in the show notes as well. Okay, that would be great. Yeah. What other research are you engaged in now or contemplating that that along the lines of K through 12 education, especially? I mean, I'm interested in higher education, but we are a K through 12 education advocacy organization, and so what else are you looking into?
Yeah, we, I hesitate to say, because I think our next project is going to be looking into a little bit of higher education and what the teacher unions are doing there, which does always have an influence on K through 12 when you get into the teacher colleges and things like that. But I would just spotlight some other parts of our work, which is so one of our reports that we've done is about how teachers unions get some of this stuff into their collective bargaining agreements. They get kind of a leftist curricular elements into collective bargaining agreements that they strike, kind of privately with these schools. And one thing to realize is that it's the teacher unions who get the members of the school board elected. They get these the staff of the school district, the leaders of the school district appointed. And so it's really them negotiating across the table from each other. And that, no example is better than this, the Chicago Teachers Union getting Brandon Johnson, elected as mayor. And so there's this real conflict of interest. One thing I would like to explore soon is like getting this conflict of interest to the surface and trying to either prohibit people who have accepted teachers union financial support from bargaining with them. They should have to recuse themselves from bargaining with the teachers union that helped elect them, or having some kind of pledge for sane, reasonable school, leaders of school districts that say, I will not, accept money and then go off and, sit across the table from these teachers union to bargain. So that's something that I'm really interested in doing in the months, maybe year ahead.
Have you looked at all at teachers' colleges, their role, what they're teaching their teachers or future teachers?
I haven't looked and done specific research on it. All I would know from the very little I know is just it sounds like it's a mess, and I think teachers are often being graduated from kind of like incubated in kind of an anti-Israel, anti-Semitic mindset, or anti-United States institutional mindset, and then being foisted onto children in classrooms. But I wouldn't be able to say too much more than that. I don't know about yourself, if you have studied that issue at all.
Yeah, we have been looking at it, and we're going to look at it further. We've examined specifically this trend of decolonizing the syllabus or decolonizing education, which is basically to root out any Western influence from teaching kids, which is, of course, absurd and outrageous, yet, quite commonplace in ed schools. And it's interesting because these ed schools don't just educate the future, like K through 12 schools, teachers, they also educate the future deans in higher education. And if you look at the role that they play in actually peopling the administrative bureaucracy of higher education, it's also quite damaging. And they're sort of at the center, I think, of this ideological maelstrom that needs to be dealt with. And how you do it and what points of leverage we have in trying to, diversify the model so that you have, rational teachers colleges as well, or teachers colleges that are rooted in actual education and not in, in ideology. I just think there's a lot that needs to be done, and it is a generational project, not something that you can just do overnight. And that's what's can be a little scary about all this work, is that that we've been asleep at the wheel collectively for a long time while these things have taken shape. And it's going to take a while to undo. Like you can see a wholesale shift in society at large, and in its view of DEI and opening up the conversation, and yet these trends still persist in these specific institutions where they enjoy the greatest amount of support.
Yeah, and one of the points of our report, The Fall of Woke, that we just put out, and kind of chronicle some of the craziness of the national teachers unions and many other teachers union, is that people are waiting out the current administration. The teachers unions are uniquely placed to do this because they have so much funding from teacher union dues. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars on political activities, or send it to their affiliates to spend on lobbying and political activities. So they feel like they can really wait out the current moment, which I think has turned against DEI, which has turned, I think people are starting to be shocked by the kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric and anti-Israel rhetoric that's coming out of some of the teachers unions, and especially the NEA, what they've been doing, what they were doing at their summer meetings, for instance. But they feel like they can wait out this moment and just kind of go underground and then come back up when, in the next a friendly administration. So it's not over. The fight's not over. The battle against woke, or whatever you want to call it, the DEI stuff and the anti-Western mindset. We really do need to work toward changing the culture, because just executive orders and having leaders who are who do not like DEI and do not like this kind of anti-Western rhetoric and garbage that's coming out of these institutions, that's not going to cut it. I think we really need to convince convince people that it is anathema to society, and we need to keep on working on that.
Although it might raise the stakes, it might create more liabilities that they didn't feel like they had before. They may be more scared of being sued on discrimination than they did before, or of losing funding, and it's clearly changed something in the decision-making framework of school policymakers, because you can feel it being on the outs. So I agree 100% with the core point that it's got to go beyond that, but it is having an effect on the culture of schools in some ways, right?
It really is. I think I can't speak for schools in general, but I think it's having an effect on universities and the way they talk about this stuff. And once you start that process, I think that's really important.
Right. Because a lot of people don't want it. The moderates didn't like it in the first place, but they didn't want to be called names, so they went along with it. Those people become increasingly powerful with that, because they start to say, do we really want this headache? Do we need this headache? It empowers them to sort of have a voice within the conversation in their university.
Yeah. And I think we have to look at the fact that people were intimidated, and still are, to a certain extent, I think, to speak out in class and to actually share their viewpoints. And if we can move the needle a bit, if these, for instance, if people are afraid of getting sued because they allow just anti-Semitic harassment and attacks in their education programs, and they worry about government enforcement, if the government can make universities realize, hey, I might lose all of my federal funding if I keep on doing this, or I might have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to settle this, like, a place like Columbia did. I think that's a positive. That's a positive move, and it kind of has to start there, and then we have to keep on soldiering on and make people understand, convince people to keep on doing it, because I think you can just look at public opinion shifts at any different time, and they might just they might shift back the other way in the next election, just depending on what's happening. So let's keep on beating that drum.
I have a question for you. It might be a little off the beaten track here. So groups like mine are constantly wrestling with, how do we frame this ideological challenge? Do we frame it in terms of anti-Semitism? This is generating anti-Semitism against Jews, and that's bad, and you should be concerned about your fellow Jewish citizens? Or do we say this is an assault on American civic values and Western values and the like, because Jews are a small percentage? Most Americans don't, wake up in the morning and go to bed at night thinking about the well-being of Jews, because they have their own issues, whatever. We're a small percentage of society, but they do care about how America is portrayed. But it's interesting, and that's my bias, is the latter, is that we should frame this increasingly as an assault on American and Western values and not on Jews in particular. But yet I find, you issued a report on how it gins up anti-Semitism. And, it was really the December 5th hearing on 2023 that, which was specifically about how these universities had a double standard around anti-Semitism and Jews, that really created the momentum around universities. And so I just want to get your sense, like, should we be leaning into how Jews are affected, or should we be leaning into how America is affected?
I think we need to lean into how Jews are affected now, because I think it's starting to get very clear what the radical left is after, and the people who talk about the oppressed and oppressor mindset. I think it's becoming more and more like naked anti-Semitism. So I think we need to call that out anytime that it rears its head, and we can't just necessarily talk in really broad terms about this stuff and say this is really, we need to link it back to anti-Western stuff, because that's definitely part of what it is, and that in my opinion, that kind of underlies it all. It's like, the Israel is kind of a white state, just like the United States, and so they're oppressing the non-white states, in their vicinity. So it does link back, but I think it's a really urgent issue right now that we need to face, and we need to make sure that we're kind of shouting from the rooftops. This is anti-Semitism, and whenever anti-Semitism gets so intense, I think we need to call it out, whether it's on the left or the right. and we need to make sure that the people who are, make sure that message is not taking hold, and making sure we're combating the anti-Semitic rhetoric that comes out.
Yeah. So my last question really is about the right. What we've seen on the left in the last few years predictably stirred up a backlash on the right that I think we're seeing. And you see figures like Nick Fuentes, who, will talk about anybody who condemns anti-Semitism is engaging in the same sort of wokery that we saw in the 2021 in the sort of big woke moment. And so they're saying that, any type of policing of discourse is problematic, and they're playing on that, and they're ginning up all kinds of opposition to it, and they're using it as sort of in a very traditional anti-Semitic canard. I guess, how concerned are you about these trends on the right? I mean, we just had the whole issue at Heritage and what happened there. And, it's just unavoidable. And I think to a point you can say, yes, this was stirred up by what happened on the left. But at some point, just as the left has agency, the right has agency. And you have to say, you have to take control of your own forces. You can't continue to point the finger at the left and blame them for making you less rational. At some point, the adults in the room have to win out, or you're in trouble just as you're pointing out the left is in trouble. So what is your take on all that? What needs to be done?
I think it is definitely very concerning, and I think we have to take it very seriously, whether it's on the left or the right. And I think I worry when people from young conservatives or old conservatives, whoever is following this stuff is and is feeling like that's their outlet, like this anti-Semitic stuff. That is that's the real message. How are we losing these people? I think we need to think about, why are these people falling for these conspiracy theories, or falling for this false history that these people are putting out there. So I am definitely concerned about that, and I think we need to take it very seriously. And I think we need to try to get people. One, we need to exclude messages of hatred, against the Jews or against anybody else from our movement. We have to make it clear that they have no place in our movement. And we need to think about why are people gravitating toward that message right now? Is it about some kind of frustration with conservatives for not being able to deal with their concerns, like what their real concerns are, whether it's cost of living, or they feel like nothing ever changes in Washington? So I think we need to take a hard look at ourselves and say, what can we do better to kind of capture these people, get these people back in the fold, so they're not just chasing down conspiracy theories. And I think it's a lot of young people who just, and I've seen some research that shows some of them even come from the left, and they're newly in the right, who are kind of falling for these things.
Yeah, they're very much in the middle of the horseshoe, and sometimes it's hard, and you see the two sides of the horseshoe flirting with each other. I mean, I saw, Code Pink visit Marjorie Taylor Greene on her exit from office and thanking her for all her work. That was sort of one recent example. And you see Nick Fuentes saying we can strike a new deal with the left in which we drop our support for capitalism and they drop their support for immigration. I'm not saying it constitutes a new movement. And movement I've been calling the Red-Brown Alliance, because that's what it's called in Europe. But it you could imagine it in this environment taking hold, where that starts to become more and more prevalent. So I think we have to be on guard for that. And I agree, part of it is that, each of the side has to police its own better and spend more time, taking stock of these dangerous trends in their body politic, and then try to root them out and keep them on the sidelines. And, I think some of that happened, by the way, with the Heritage Foundation. I think there were a lot of very thoughtful people like Ted Cruz who came out and spoke in no uncertain terms about the dangers here. And there are others who were less impressive. Overall, I think there were more antibodies on the right than there were on the left. Sometimes it's because what's on the right tends to be more brazen than it's on the left, even though what's on the left might be more dangerous. It's still good to see that, but I think it's a work in progress, and I'm not sure where it's going to end up. It's a very disconcerting moment in our country's politics, and I think Jews are going to feel the full effects of that more than maybe a lot of other groups will feel it first, at least. I think everybody feels it. It just might experience it a little differently. And
and that's one reason we need to be talking about anti-Semitism and not just the broader, anti-Western mindset. I think anti-Semitism is a very specific thing that has existed for so long that we need to recognize when it's on the rise, and we need to fight it no matter where it comes from. So I think we should be specific about it and target our messages against it, and also offer a message pro-capitalist, or a pro-freedom message, so that we don't lose people to these conspiracy theories and to anti-Semitic rhetoric.
Yeah, could not agree more. Well, Paul, thank you for the work that you do and your organization does, and I look forward to exploring ways that we might be able to partner on some of this. I think we probably do a lot of parallel research, and it would be good to compare notes as we're doing today, and to develop common strategy when it makes sense, and to be in conversation with each other. So thank you for your work and your time.
Thank you so much, David. I will relish that opportunity to compare notes with you. I appreciate it.
Take care.